The quiet suburb lit up in flashes of red and blue, sharp, harsh, impossible to ignore. In the rear-view mirror of his 2024 Lincoln Navigator, the reflection of a police cruiser cut through the calm like a blade. Colonel Marcus Jackson had survived firefights in Iraq, ambushes in Afghanistan, but the cold knot tightening in his stomach right now? This was different. No bullets, no battlefield, just a siren and a uniform with the power to decide how this night would end. He'd done nothing wrong, just a veteran driving home, yet the wail of that siren felt like an accusation. The officer walking up to his window was young, stiff, radiating authority he didn't yet understand. And in that moment, Marcus knew this wasn't a routine traffic stop. It was a test of a man's resilience, of a nation's unspoken fears, and of a system still struggling to see the man instead of the skin he lived in. The streetlights cast long, skeletal shadows across the gleaming black hood of the Lincoln Navigator. Colonel Jackson watched the approaching officer in his side mirror. The young man's hand rested on his holstered service weapon, a casual posture that was anything but. The colonel, a man who had stared death in the face more times than he cared to remember, felt the bitter taste of a familiar poison. It was the taste of prejudice, a venom he had been forced to swallow his entire life. He took a slow, measured breath, a technique honed in the crucible of combat, a method to still the tremor in his hands, to quell the surge of righteous anger that threatened to erupt. He had led men into battle, had been responsible for their lives, their fears, their hopes. He had earned their respect, their loyalty, their trust. But here, on this quiet, tree-lined street in the country he had sworn to defend, he was just another black man in a luxury car, a suspect before he had even spoken a word. "License and registration," the officer said, his voice flat, devoid of the simple courtesy of a please. The colonel, his movements slow and deliberate, retrieved his documents. He knew the drill. Keep your hands visible. No sudden movements. Speak in a calm, respectful tone, even when your own respect is being shredded like a worthless piece of paper. As he handed them over, the officer's eyes flickered from the colonel's face to the opulent interior of the Navigator, the supple leather seats, the polished wood grain, the soft ambient lighting. It was a vehicle that whispered of success, a success that, in the officer's narrow world view, seemed out of place. "This your car?" the officer asked, his tone laced with a thinly veiled accusation. "Yes, it is," the colonel replied, his voice a low, steady rumble that betrayed none of the tempest that raged within him. The officer, whose name tag identified him as Miller, took a half-step back, his eyes sweeping over the immaculate vehicle, searching for a flaw, a dent, a scratch, anything to justify this baseless intrusion. He found nothing. "Where are you headed this time of night?" Miller's questions grew more pointed, more accusatory. "I'm on my way home," the colonel said, the thin thread of his patience beginning to fray. "I live 2 blocks from here." Miller's gaze narrowed. "We've had reports of burglaries in this area, high-end vehicles being used as getaway cars." The implication was a physical blow, a tightening in the colonel's chest that made it difficult to breathe. A decorated war hero, a man who had dedicated 30 years of his life to the service of his country, was being treated like a common thief. The injustice of it was a searing white-hot poker in his soul. He could have ended it right there. He could have pulled out his military ID, flashed his rank, and watched the young officer's arrogant facade crumble into a pile of embarrassed apologies. But he wouldn't. He wouldn't use his rank as a shield. He was a citizen, and he had rights. And he would stand on those rights, even if it meant enduring this humiliating charade. "I'm not a burglar, officer," the colonel said, his voice firm, unwavering, imbued with the quiet authority of a man who had commanded armies. "I'm a retired United States Army colonel. I've fought for the very freedoms that you are now so carelessly trampling upon." The words, a direct challenge to Miller's authority, hung in the air like a guillotine. The young officer's face flushed with a mixture of anger and surprise. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged, especially not by a black man in a car he couldn't afford. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," Miller said, his voice now laced with a cold, hard menace. The colonel knew he had a choice: comply, submit, and hope for the best, or stand his ground, assert his rights, and risk escalating a situation that was already spiraling out of control. He thought of the young soldiers he had led, the men who had looked to him for courage, for guidance, for a reason to believe in something bigger than themselves. He thought of the promises he had made to them, the promises he had made to himself. He would not back down. Slowly, deliberately, he opened the car door and stepped into the cool night air. He was a tall man, with a commanding presence that even his civilian clothes could not diminish. He stood his ground, his eyes locked on Miller's, a silent, epic battle of wills playing out on a quiet suburban street. The flashing lights of the police cruiser painted the scene in a macabre, almost cinematic light, casting long dancing shadows that seemed to whisper of 1,000 similar encounters, 1,000 similar injustices. This was more than a traffic stop. It was a confrontation, a clash of two Americas, one that saw a threat where there was none, and one that demanded to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. The tension on the quiet street was a palpable entity, a thick, suffocating blanket that seemed to muffle the sounds of the night. Colonel Jackson stood ramrod straight, a lifetime of military discipline etched into his very posture. He faced Officer Miller, his gaze as unyielding as the steel of his resolve. The flashing red and blue lights of the patrol car pulsed in time with the throbbing in the colonel's temples. This was a different kind of battlefield, one where the weapons were not guns and bombs, but perceptions and prejudices, a war he had been fighting his entire life. "I asked you a question, sir," Miller repeated, his hand now firmly on his holstered weapon. The thin veneer of professionalism had cracked, revealing the raw, ugly prejudice that lay beneath. "Why are you in this neighborhood?" The colonel took a slow, deliberate breath, calming the storm of anger that raged within him. He had faced down men with far more firepower and far less to lose than this young, overzealous officer. He would not be baited. "I live here," the colonel stated simply, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded attention. He gestured to a stately two-story brick house just down the street, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. "That's my home. I was on my way back from a late meeting at the Pentagon." Miller's eyes followed the colonel's gesture, a flicker of disbelief in his gaze. The house was a grand affair, with a perfectly manicured lawn and a 3-car garage. It was a house that spoke of wealth, of success, of a life that Miller, in his narrow worldview, couldn't reconcile with the man standing before him. "You're telling me you live in that house?" Miller scoffed, a smirk playing on his lips. "You expect me to believe that?" The colonel's jaw tightened. The disrespect was a slap in the face. He had fought for this country, bled for it, and yet, in his own neighborhood, he was being treated like an intruder. "I don't expect you to believe anything, officer," the colonel said, his voice laced with an icy calm that was far more intimidating than any shout. "I'm telling you the facts. Now, am I being detained, or am I free to go?" The question hung in the air, a direct challenge to Miller's authority. The young officer was taken aback. He was used to deference to fear. This man, this colonel, was different. There was a power in his stillness, a quiet confidence that unnerved Miller. He stammered for a moment, his bravado failing him. I need to run your license," he said, retreating to the familiar territory of procedure. As Miller walked back to his patrol car, the colonel remained standing by his navigator, a solitary figure bathed in the flashing lights. He could feel the eyes of his neighbors on him, peering through their curtains, their own prejudices. He was a spectacle, a curiosity. From his patrol car, Miller ran the colonel's license. The information that flashed across his screen made his breath catch in his throat. Colonel Marcus Jackson, United States Army, retired. Recipient of the Silver Star. the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart. A 30-year veteran with a record of distinguished service as long as his arm. This wasn't just some guy in a fancy car. This was a legitimate war hero. A wave of shame washed over Miller. He had been so quick to judge. He had let his own biases cloud his judgment, and in doing so, he had disrespected a man who deserved nothing but the utmost respect. He got out of his car, the swagger gone, replaced by a hesitant uncertainty. He approached the colonel, his eyes downcast. "Colonel Jackson," he began, his voice barely a whisper. I apologize. There's been a mistake." The colonel looked at the young officer, his expression unreadable. He could have savored this moment, reveled in Miller's discomfort. But that wasn't his way. "There was no mistake, officer," the colonel said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You made a judgment based on the color of my skin and the car I drive. You saw a threat where there was none. And that is a problem, not just for me, but for you, and for the community you are sworn to protect." The words hit Miller harder than any physical blow. They were the truth, a truth he had never been forced to confront. He looked at the colonel, really looked at him, and for the first time he saw not a suspect, but a man of dignity, of honor, of immense and quiet strength. "You're right," Miller said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was wrong, and I am truly sorry." The apology, heartfelt and genuine, seemed to break the tension. The flashing lights of the patrol car were switched off, and the quiet suburban night returned to its peaceful slumber. The colonel nodded, a silent acceptance of the apology, a silent acknowledgement of the small, fragile bridge of understanding that had been built between them. This was a small victory, a quiet one, but a victory nonetheless. And in the quiet stillness of the night, the colonel allowed himself a small, private smile. The battle was far from over, but for tonight at least, he had won. The silence that descended upon the street after Officer Miller's apology was a heavy, contemplative one. The flashing lights of the cruiser were gone, leaving only the soft, steady glow of the streetlights to illuminate the scene. The colonel stood by his navigator, the cool night air a welcome balm on his frayed nerves. He looked at the young officer, who now seemed smaller, less imposing, his uniform a little too big for his suddenly slumped shoulders. Miller's face was a canvas of conflicting emotions, shame, regret, and a dawning awareness of his own fallibility. The colonel, a man trained to read people as easily as he read a battlefield map, saw something else in the young officer's eyes, a flicker of genuine remorse. It was a small thing, a barely perceptible shift in his demeanor, but it was enough. It was a starting point. "We all make mistakes, son," the colonel said, his voice softer now, imbued with the wisdom of a man who had seen the best and worst of humanity. "The measure of a man is not in the mistakes he makes, but in what he does after he makes them." The words, spoken with a quiet authority that transcended rank and uniform, seemed to land with a profound weight on the young officer. He looked up, his eyes meeting the colonel's, and for the first time that night, there was a glimmer of mutual respect. I'd like to make this right," Miller stammered, his voice still thick with a mixture of shame and a newfound determination. The colonel considered the young man before him. He could have dismissed him, sent him on his way with a stern warning and a lingering sense of guilt, but that wasn't his style. He was a builder of bridges, not a burner of them. He had spent his life leading men, mentoring them, helping them to become better versions of themselves. And in that moment, he saw in Officer Miller not an adversary, but a young man in need of guidance, a man who had been taught to see the world in black and white, but was now being confronted with the infinite shades of gray that lay in between. An idea, unexpected and unconventional, began to form in the colonel's mind. It was a risk, a departure from the predictable script of such encounters. But the colonel was a man who had built a career on taking calculated risks. "My wife is a wonderful cook," the colonel said, a faint smile touching his lips. "She always makes too much food. I'm sure she wouldn't mind setting an extra plate for dinner tomorrow night." The invitation hung in the air, a startling and unexpected olive branch. Miller was stunned into silence. He had expected a lecture, a complaint to his superiors, perhaps even a lawsuit. He had not expected this. He had not expected grace. "Sir?" Miller asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and a dawning sense of hope. "You heard me, son," the colonel said, his smile widening. "Come to my house for dinner tomorrow. My wife Sarah makes a pot roast that could bring a tear to a glass eye, and it will give us a chance to talk, really talk. Not as a cop and a suspect, but as two men who share a community and a responsibility to make it better." The sincerity in the colonel's voice was undeniable. This wasn't a trap or a trick or a test. It was a genuine offer of reconciliation, an opportunity to move beyond the ugliness of their initial encounter and find some common ground. Miller, who had been raised on a steady diet of suspicion and cynicism, found himself at a loss for words. The colonel's act of kindness was so unexpected, so disarming, that it shattered the carefully constructed walls of his own prejudice. I don't know what to say," Miller finally managed, his voice filled with a genuine and profound gratitude. "Say you'll come," the colonel said, his hand extended in a gesture of peace. Miller looked at the outstretched hand, a hand that had known the weight of a rifle, the sting of a salute, the warmth of a handshake. He hesitated for a moment, then reached out and took it. The handshake was firm, a silent agreement, a promise of a new beginning. As Miller walked back to his patrol car, his mind was reeling. The world, which had seemed so simple, so black and white just an hour ago, was now a kaleidoscope of complex and confusing colors. He had pulled over a black man in a fancy car, expecting to find a criminal. Instead, he had found a hero, and in the process, he had been forced to confront the hero and the villain that resided within himself. The colonel watched him go, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. He knew that one dinner would not erase a lifetime of prejudice, but it was a start. It was a small act of defiance against the forces of division and hate that threatened to tear their society apart. It was a testament to the power of human connection, the power of a shared meal, the power of a simple, heartfelt conversation. He got back into his Navigator, the scent of the leather interior a familiar comfort. As he drove the short distance to his house, he thought about the unexpected turn the evening had taken. He had been prepared for a fight, for a struggle, for a battle of wills. He had not been prepared for an opportunity to teach, to learn, to grow, an opportunity to build a bridge where a wall had once stood. And as he pulled into his driveway, the warm glow of his home, a welcoming beacon in the darkness, he knew that this was a battle worth fighting, not with guns and ammunition, but with something far more powerful, a plate of his wife's pot roast and a willingness to see the humanity in the other. The aroma of Sarah Jackson's pot roast filled the house, a rich, savory scent that was the very essence of home. It was a smell that had welcomed the colonel back from countless deployments, a comforting anchor in the often turbulent sea of his life. Tonight, however, it was a smell that was freighted with a different kind of anticipation. Tonight, they were having a guest for dinner. A guest who, just 24 hours earlier, had seen the colonel as a threat, a suspect, a man who didn't belong. The colonel, dressed in a comfortable pair of slacks and a crisp, button-down shirt, stood by the window, watching as Officer Miller's patrol car pulled up to the curb. He had called his precinct and requested to come in his uniform, a sign of respect, he had said. The colonel had agreed. He wanted Miller to come as he was, to bring his whole self to the table, not just the contrite, apologetic version he had shown the night before. Sarah, a woman whose grace and strength were the bedrock of the colonel's life, came and stood beside him, her hand finding his. "Are you sure about this, Marcus?" she asked, her voice a soft murmur. "I am," he replied, his eyes never leaving the young officer who was now walking up their front path. "I have to be." The doorbell rang, and the colonel went to answer it. He opened the door to find a nervous-looking Officer Miller standing on his porch, a bottle of wine in his hand. "Good evening, sir," Miller said, his voice a little shaky. "Welcome, officer," the colonel said, a warm smile on his face. "Please come in." Miller stepped inside, his eyes widening in awe as he took in the interior of the house. It was a home that was filled with love and life, with art and books and photographs that told the story of a family that had traveled the world, that had lived and loved and laughed. It was a home that was a world away from the sterile, impersonal environment of his own small apartment. Sarah came forward, her hand extended. "Officer Miller, I'm Sarah Jackson. It's a pleasure to have you in our home." Miller, who was used to dealing with people at their worst, was momentarily disarmed by her warmth, her genuine kindness. "It's an honor to be here, ma'am," he said, his voice filled with a sincerity that surprised even himself. They sat down to dinner, the table laden with a feast that was a testament to Sarah's culinary skills. The pot roast was, as the colonel had promised, a work of art, tender and flavorful, accompanied by roasted potatoes, glazed carrots, and a fresh, green salad. For a while, the conversation was polite, stilted, the arias of small talk that people make when they are trying to bridge a chasm of misunderstanding. They talked about the weather, about sports, about the local news. But as the meal progressed, as the wine was poured and the bread was broken, the conversation began to deepen, to take on a more personal, more intimate tone. Miller, who had been raised to see the world in terms of us and them, of good guys and bad guys, found himself listening, really listening, to the colonel's stories. He heard about the colonel's childhood in a segregated South, about the sting of racism, the indignity of being judged by the color of his skin. He heard about the colonel's decision to join the army, to prove that he was just as good, just as patriotic as any white man. And the colonel, in turn, listened to Miller's stories. He heard about the young officer's working-class upbringing, about his father, a factory worker who had lost his job to a changing economy. He heard about Miller's own struggles, his own fears, his own sense of being left behind. As they talked, the labels that had defined them, cop and suspect, black and white, rich and poor, began to fall away. They were just two men, two Americans, trying to make their way in a world that was often confusing, often unfair, often cruel. And in that shared space of vulnerability, of honesty, of a willingness to see the world through another's eyes, something remarkable began to happen. A connection was forged, a bridge was built. After dinner, the colonel took Miller to his study, a room lined with books and memorabilia from his long and distinguished military career. He showed him the flag that had been flown over his base in Afghanistan, the medals he had earned, the photographs of the men he had led into battle. And then he showed him a small framed photograph of a young boy with a bright, infectious smile. "This is my son, David," the colonel said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "He was killed in action in Iraq. He was 22 years old." The words hung in the air, a devastating testament to the cost of war, the cost of service, the cost of a life cut short. Miller looked at the photograph, at the young man's smiling face, and he felt a profound sense of shame. He had been so quick to judge the colonel, so quick to see him as a threat. He had never once considered the sacrifices he had made, the losses he had endured. "I'm so sorry, sir," Miller said, his voice barely a whisper. The colonel nodded, his eyes still fixed on the photograph of his son. "He was a good boy," he said, his voice filled with a father's love, a father's pride, a father's unending grief. He believed in this country. He believed in the promise of it. He believed that we could be better than we are. The words were a powerful indictment of the prejudice, the intolerance, the hatred that had brought Miller to the colonel's doorstep the night before. They were a challenge, a call to action, a plea for a better, more just, more compassionate world. As Miller drove home that night, the city lights a blur through his tear-filled eyes, he knew that he had been changed. The dinner had been more than just a meal. It had been a lesson a lesson in empathy, in understanding, in the shared humanity that binds us all together. He had gone to the colonel's house expecting to find an enemy. Instead, he had found a friend. And in that friendship, he had found a new and unexpected path forward, a path that was not paved with suspicion and fear, but with a newfound sense of hope, of purpose, of a shared responsibility to build a better world. One conversation, one connection, one act of kindness at a time. The road ahead was long, and the work was hard. But for the first time in a long time, Officer Miller felt like he was on the right side of it. The dinner at the colonel's house was not an end, but a beginning. It was a single stone cast into the still waters of a community, and the ripples it created began to spread in ways that no one could have anticipated. Officer Miller, a man who had once been a part of the problem, now became a part of the solution. He started to see his beat, not as a collection of potential suspects, but as a neighborhood of individuals, each with their own story, their own struggles, their own dreams. He made a conscious effort to get out of his patrol car, to walk the streets, to talk to people, to listen to their concerns. He started a weekly basketball game with the kids in the local park, a small gesture that had a big impact. It broke down the barriers of fear and mistrust that had long existed between the police and the community they were sworn to serve. The colonel, for his part, became a mentor to the young officer. They met for coffee once a week, their conversations ranging from police reform to parenting, from the challenges of leadership to the joys of a well-tended garden. The colonel saw in Miller a young man who was eager to learn, to grow, to make a difference. And he, in turn, found in their friendship a renewed sense of purpose, a way to continue to serve his country, not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, often overlooked corners of his own community. But the ripple effect of their unlikely friendship did not stop there. It spread to the police precinct, where Miller's change in attitude and approach began to be noticed. His fellow officers, who had once been his partners in cynicism and suspicion, started to ask him questions. They wanted to know what had changed him. And Miller, in his own quiet, unassuming way, told them about the colonel, about the dinner, about the power of a simple conversation to change a heart, to change a mind, to change a life. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, things began to change. The precinct started to implement new community policing initiatives, to host town hall meetings, to create opportunities for officers and citizens to interact in non-confrontational settings. The wall of silence, the blue wall that had for so long separated the police from the people they served, began to crumble, brick by brick. But the biggest change, the most profound ripple, was yet to come. It came in the form of a crisis, a moment that would test the newfound bonds of trust and understanding that had been forged between the police and the community. A young black man, a teenager named Jamal, was accused of a crime he did not commit. The evidence against him was flimsy, circumstantial, but in a town with a long and troubled history of racial profiling, it was enough. The old patterns of suspicion and mistrust began to reemerge. The community was on edge, a powder keg of anger and frustration waiting for a spark to ignite it. But this time, things were different. This time, there was a bridge. Officer Miller, who knew Jamal from the weekly basketball games, refused to believe that he was guilty. He went to his superiors, he argued, he pleaded, he put his own career on the line to defend the young man he had come to know and respect. And the colonel, a man who had the ear of the mayor, the city council, the chief of police, used his influence, his credibility, his moral authority to demand a fair and impartial investigation. He organized a town hall meeting, a space for the community to voice their fears, their anger, their hopes for a better, more just future. It was at that town hall meeting that the true power of the ripple effect was revealed. It was a tense, emotionally charged affair. The room was packed, a microcosm of the community, black and white, rich and poor, old and young. The air was thick with a mixture of hope and despair. And then, in the midst of the anger and the accusations, a young woman stood up to speak. She was Jamal's mother, a single mom who had worked 2 jobs to provide for her son. Her voice was trembling, but her words were strong. She didn't talk about hate, or anger, or revenge. She talked about love. She talked about her son, about his dreams of going to college, of becoming a doctor. She talked about her faith, her belief in the inherent goodness of people. And then she talked about a police officer who had taken the time to get to know her son, to see him not as a statistic, but as a human being. She talked about Officer Miller, and as she spoke, something shifted in the room. The anger began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of shared humanity, of a common purpose. People started to talk to each other, to listen to each other, to see each other not as adversaries, but as neighbors. The town hall meeting was a turning point. It was a moment when a community on the brink of tearing itself apart chose a different path. It chose the path of dialogue, of understanding, of reconciliation. It chose the path that had been forged by 2 men, a black colonel and a white cop, who had dared to sit down at a dinner table and see the humanity in each other. The charges against Jamal were eventually dropped. The real perpetrator was found, and justice, for once, was served. But the real victory was not in the courtroom. It was in the hearts and minds of a community that had learned that the only way to build a better future is to build it together. The ripple effect of that one traffic stop, that one dinner, that one act of grace continued to spread, a testament to the power of a single individual to make a difference, to the power of a community to heal itself, to the power of hope to triumph over despair. The road ahead was still long, and the work was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, the people of this small, unassuming town felt like they were on the right side of history, on the right side of hope, on the right side of a future that they were building together. The annual Mayor's Community Leadership Award ceremony was a grand affair, held in the city's historic town hall. The room was filled with the city's movers and shakers, its philanthropists and politicians, its community activists and everyday heroes. It was a night to celebrate the best of the city, to honor those who had gone above and beyond to make it a better place to live. This year, however, there was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. The keynote speaker was a surprise, a closely guarded secret that had been the subject of much speculation in the local press. The Colonel and Sarah were seated at a table near the front, guests of honor of the mayor. Officer Miller was there too with his wife, a young woman with a kind smile and a quiet strength that reminded the Colonel of Sarah. The 2 couples had become fast friends, their lives intertwined in a way that none of them could have ever predicted. The mayor, a man who had been a vocal supporter of the new community policing initiatives, took to the stage. He spoke of the progress the city had made, of the bridges that had been built, of the wounds that had begun to heal. And then he spoke of 2 men, 2 unlikely heroes, whose story had become a symbol of the city's transformation. "Tonight," the mayor said, his voice ringing with a genuine and profound emotion, "we are here to honor 2 such individuals, 2 men from vastly different backgrounds, who, through an act of courage and an act of grace, showed us all the way forward. They are a testament to the power of human connection, to the power of a simple conversation to change the world." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "It is my great honor," he continued, "to present this year's Community Leadership Award to Colonel Marcus Jackson and Officer David Miller." The room erupted in a thunderous applause. The Colonel and Miller, their faces a mixture of surprise and humility, made their way to the stage. They stood side by side, a black man in a tailored suit and a white man in a police uniform, a powerful symbol of the unity and reconciliation that had taken root in their community. They accepted the award, their hands clasped together in a gesture of solidarity that was more eloquent than any words. The applause washed over them, a wave of gratitude and appreciation from a community that they had helped to heal. But the surprises were not over. As the applause died down, the mayor returned to the podium. "And now," he said, a twinkle in his eye, It is my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker, a man who has dedicated his life to service, to justice, and to the unwavering belief that we are all, as he so eloquently puts it, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. James Washington. A gasp went through the crowd. Dr. James Washington was a civil rights icon, a living legend, a man who had marched with Dr. King, who had dedicated his life to the fight for equality and justice. He was a hero, a national treasure, and his presence here, in their small, unassuming city, was a profound and unexpected honor. Dr. Washington, a man in his late 80s, his body frail but his spirit as fiery as ever, walked slowly to the stage, his every step a testament to a life of struggle, of sacrifice, of unwavering commitment to a cause greater than himself. He began to speak, his voice a low, melodic baritone that filled the room with its power and its poetry. He spoke of the long, arduous journey of the civil rights movement, of the victories that had been won, of the battles that still remained. And then he turned his attention to the Colonel and Officer Miller. "I have heard the story of these two men," he said, his eyes finding theirs in the crowd. "And in their story, I hear the echo of a dream of a nation where we will not be judged by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character. A dream of a day when the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, his words a powerful and poignant reminder of the work that still needed to be done. "The road to that dream is long and it is hard," he continued, his voice rising with a preacher's cadence. "It is a road that is paved with an uncomfortable and sometimes an inconvenient truth. It is a road that requires us to confront our own biases, our own prejudices, our own fears." And then he looked directly at Officer Miller. "It takes a special kind of courage," he said, "for a man to admit when he is wrong, to look in the mirror and to not like what he sees, and to have the strength, the humility, and the grace to change." And then he turned to the Colonel. "And it takes a special kind of grace," he said, his voice filled with a profound and abiding respect, "for a man to forgive, to offer a hand of friendship to someone who has wronged him, to build a bridge where a wall has once stood." He paused, his eyes welling with tears. "And that, my friends," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, "is the only way forward. That is the only way we will ever truly become one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." He concluded his speech with a story that no one in the room had ever heard before. It was a story about a young boy, a boy who had grown up in the segregated South, a boy who had been taught to hate, to fear, to see the world in black and white. It was a story about a boy who had been raised by a father who was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, a boy who had been taught that he was superior, that he was better, that he was entitled. That boy, Dr. Washington said, his voice filled with a lifetime of pain and a lifetime of hope, was me. A stunned silence fell over the room. The revelation was a bombshell, a shocking and unexpected twist that no one had seen coming. "I was that boy," Dr. Washington repeated, his voice now strong, clear, unwavering. "But I was saved. I was saved by the grace of a God who works in mysterious ways. I was saved by the love of a community that refused to give up on me, and I was saved by the friendship of a man who saw in me not a monster, but a human being. A man who taught me how to love, how to forgive, how to see the humanity in everyone, even those who would wish me harm." He paused, his eyes finding the Colonel's in the crowd. "That man," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that was too deep for words, "was your father." The room erupted in a collective gasp. The Colonel, his face a mask of shock and disbelief, looked at Dr. Washington, his mind reeling. His father? His father, a humble preacher from a small town in Georgia, a man who had dedicated his life to the service of others, had been the one to save Dr. James Washington from a life of hatred and bigotry. The revelation was a stunning, life-altering truth, a truth that changed everything. It was a truth that connected the past to the present, a truth that showed that the seeds of love and forgiveness that had been planted by his father so many years ago had now, in this moment, in this room, come to full and glorious fruition. It was a legacy of love, a legacy of grace, a legacy of a father's unwavering belief in the power of the human heart to change. And in that moment, the colonel understood. He understood that the dinner with Officer Miller, the friendship that had blossomed, the community that had been healed, was not just a random act of kindness. It was a continuation of his father's work. It was his destiny. It was his legacy. And as he looked at Officer Miller, his friend, his brother, he knew that their work was far from over. It was just beginning. The revelations of the awards ceremony sent shockwaves through the community and, indeed, the nation. The story of the colonel, Officer Miller, and the unexpected connection to the civil rights icon, Dr. James Washington, became a national news story. It was a story of hope, of reconciliation, of the enduring power of a father's love to change the course of history. In the days and weeks that followed, the colonel and Dr. Washington spent hours together, talking, sharing stories, piecing together the fragments of a past that had been hidden for so long. The colonel learned about his father's quiet heroism, about his unwavering commitment to justice, about his profound and abiding faith in the goodness of humanity. He learned that his father, a man he had always loved and respected, was an even greater man than he had ever known. Dr. Washington, for his part, found in the colonel a kindred spirit, a man who shared his father's courage, his integrity, his unwavering commitment to a cause greater than himself. He saw in the colonel the living embodiment of his father's legacy, a legacy of love, of forgiveness, of a life dedicated to the service of others. The two men, brought together by a twist of fate that was as shocking as it was beautiful, decided to join forces. They created a foundation, the Jackson Washington Foundation for Unity and Reconciliation, dedicated to promoting dialogue, understanding, and healing in communities across the country. The foundation's first project was in their own city. They worked with the police department to create a new training program, a program that was based not on force and intimidation, but on empathy, communication, and a deep and abiding respect for the dignity of every human being. They created a mentorship program, pairing young, at-risk youth with police officers, creating opportunities for positive, life-changing relationships to be formed. They created a community garden, a place where people from all walks of life could come together to work the soil, to share food, to build community. Officer Miller, who had been promoted to sergeant, became a key leader in the foundation's work. He was a living testament to the power of change, a walking, talking example of what was possible when a person was willing to confront their own biases, to open their heart, to see the world through another's eyes. The city, once a place of division and mistrust, became a model for the nation, a beacon of hope in a world that was too often dark and divided. People came from all over the country to learn from their example, to see for themselves what was possible when a community chose love over hate, when it chose to build bridges instead of walls. But the most profound change was not in the programs or the policies or the national recognition. It was in the small, everyday interactions between people. It was in the way a police officer smiled at a young black man, in the way a white woman and a black woman struck up a conversation in the grocery store, in the way a community came together to celebrate its diversity, to embrace its differences, to find strength in its unity. Years passed. The colonel, his hair now completely gray, his face etched with the lines of a life well lived, sat on his porch, watching his grandchildren play in the front yard. Sarah was by his side, her hand in his, their love a steady, unwavering flame that had burned brightly for over 50 years. Dr. Washington, his body now frail, his steps slow, but his spirit as indomitable as ever, was a frequent visitor to their home. He and the colonel would sit for hours, talking, laughing, reminiscing about the improbable journey that had brought them together. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the neighborhood, Officer Miller, now the chief of police, came to visit. He was no longer the young, insecure officer he had once been. He was a man who had earned the respect of his community, a leader who had dedicated his life to the service of others. He sat down with the colonel and Dr. Washington, and the three men watched the children play, their laughter a sweet, melodic sound that was the very music of hope. "You know," the chief said, his voice filled with a quiet, profound emotion, "I often think about that night, the night I pulled you over, and I think about how different my life would have been if you hadn't invited me to dinner." The colonel smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "And I often think," he said, his eyes twinkling, "about how different my life would have been if my father hadn't invited a young, angry, misguided boy to his church all those years ago." Dr. Washington nodded, a single tear tracing a path down his weathered cheek. "It's a legacy, isn't it?" he said, his voice a soft whisper. "A legacy of love, a legacy of grace, a legacy that is passed down from one generation to the next, a single candle that is passed from hand to hand, a light that can never be extinguished." The three men sat in a comfortable silence, the weight of their shared history, their shared journey, their shared hope for the future, a tangible presence between them. The children's laughter filled the air, a promise of a new day, a new beginning, a new generation that would carry the torch of their legacy forward. And in that moment, the colonel knew, with a certainty that was as deep and as abiding as his love for his wife, his family, his country, that the world was a better place. It was a better place because his father had chosen love over hate. It was a better place because he had chosen forgiveness over bitterness. It was a better place because a young police officer had had the courage to change. It was a legacy that was written not in the pages of history books, but in the hearts of a community that had learned to see the humanity in each other. It was a legacy that would live on, long after they were gone, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome even the deepest of divides, to heal even the most painful of wounds, to build a world where every life is precious, where every voice is heard, where every person is treated with the dignity and the respect they deserve. It was a legacy of love, and it was a legacy that would never die. In the end, the story of Colonel Jackson and Officer Miller reminds us of something simple, but powerful. Our shared humanity is stronger than anything that tries to divide us. One moment of courage, one moment of grace. That's all it took to turn a tense traffic stop into the beginning of a friendship that changed two men, and the community around them. Their journey is a mirror of the journey we all have to take as a nation, a journey that asks us to confront our biases, to listen with open hearts, and to build bridges where walls have stood for far too long. Because heroes aren't only found on battlefields. Sometimes they're found in quiet moments, in the choices we make when no one is cheering, when forgiveness is hard, and when compassion feels costly. Their story shows us that choosing love over hate, choosing understanding over fear, choosing humanity, even when it's difficult, can change more than a single night. It can change the world around us. If this story moved you or gave you even a little hope, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who needs this message today, and subscribe for more stories that lift the human spirit. Thank you for watching, and for being part of a community that chooses light.